When did you learn to never ignore red flags in a relationship? Unfortunately, I learned this lesson the hard way. She was half my age, a divorcee with a small son. She married too early, got pregnant, and her husband was too young to handle it. Her son's father spoiled him rotten when he took every minute of visitation he was entitled to, but he wasn't really interested in the nuts and bolts of parenting. We developed a friendship, taking lunch breaks together most days. Being a single mom was hard, but her son was her world. She said all the right things, she would die for him, every sacrifice was worth it, and his needs always come first before her own. At first, she seemed normal. Then she met a guy. She was in love. And he loved her son too. It was less than a year before he proposed. She wasn't ready, but she loved him, and he was proposing every week. She finally gave in, and after a year of dating, she remarried. He moved in with her and her 3-year-old son. It was a little rocky, but they were in love. He would steal her cookie jar money to buy pizza instead of cooking. He bounced from job to job while attending nursing school. He smoked more than they could really afford. But it all seemed like the typical problems of a young family trying to make ends meet and better themselves. And he was so good with her son. Her son started school, and there were problems. She did everything she could to help him succeed. He was diagnosed with a learning disability and was prescribed medication. Her new husband spent at least an hour every day in her son's room, helping the boy with his homework. There was bullying at school, and the two of them tried to work with the staff. The bus was the main problem, so she drove him to school. Her husband picked him up in the afternoon. Then stuff started disappearing. Little stuff, no big deal. She wrote it off as being careless or forgetful. Her son was hiding food and dirty dishes in his room. She was worried. Then medicine started to disappear. Her son's medication. Her prescription seemed to vanish faster than the recommended dosages would imply. Her son denied taking them, but would you really expect that from a 7-year-old? An entire bottle of medicine disappeared from Grandma's house. Grandma finally confronted her daughter, advising it wasn't the first time. This was the first time a brand new full bottle disappeared, but pills had gone missing before, and only when the family was visiting Grandma's. Accusations, defenses, and screaming. Storming out, the three of them returned to the apartment, vowing to never speak to Grandma again until she apologized. Her husband quit his job at the hospital out of the blue. No explanation, other than "I don't want to be a nurse anymore." Years of tuition money and classes down the drain. She was furious. Still angry over Grandma's accusations, they spent Thanksgiving with his parents instead of hers, where his brother told her how much he admired her, standing by her man in spite of his addiction problems, and all the terminations for stealing substances from medical facilities. Her brother-in-law observed that every other woman had run in the other direction when they found out about his sealed juvenile record. One look at her face, and her brother-in-law knew he'd screwed up. "Oh my God, I'm sorry, I thought you knew." Her husband had quit his job at the hospital to avoid criminal prosecution for stealing substances, agreeing to abandon nursing to avoid jail. The missing stuff out of the apartment had been sold to pay for substances. He'd stolen the whole family's prescriptions. Apparently, he was an equal opportunity offender and would take any prescription he could get his hands on. To make matters worse, he had been convicted at age 16 for selling little kids. Small children, boys and girls. Multiple incidents. Her son, when questioned, confirmed that homework wasn't the only thing her husband had helped with every night. The abuse had been going on since before he could remember. He was 3 when they married. It had happened almost daily since the wedding. She kicked him out that night. And called me. It was a really rough couple of months. A divorce would have to wait until she could afford the lawyer, but it was over immediately. I urged her to call the police. The man was a serial offender. Other children were at risk if she didn't prosecute. The court would grant a divorce as part of the proceedings. She refused. I urged her to call a therapist. She had our employer provided health insurance that would provide mental health support. She'd been blindsided and traumatized. She needed counseling to work through her unresolved and undeserved guilt. She refused. I urged her to call a therapist for her son. The boy had been regularly essayed in his own bed for more than half his life. No wonder the kid was such a problem child and a poor student. He'd been traumatized and needed counseling. She refused. She completely swept the whole thing under the rug and refused to deal with it. She just wanted to pretend that none of it happened. She finally told me that if I didn't shut up and mind my own business, we wouldn't be friends anymore. So I shut up. She skipped a couple of utility payments to pay a lawyer, and a year later she was divorced. The creep was in jail on a substance charge at the time. Then she met a new guy. He was a complete jerk, but he earned a lot more than we did, and he spent money on her. He was jealous, had herpes, and had a history of paying for intimacy. He controlled her like a wayward child, but he spent money on her. And she certainly didn't want my opinion that he was an idiot. He bought her a huge diamond and proposed. I told her she was selling out. She was a strong woman who'd gone through hell and back, and all this guy had going for him was his paycheck. She told me to shut up and mind my own business. I shut up. They got married and he bought a house. A huge house that must have seemed like a mansion. It was in his hometown 500 miles away. Now, She could be a full-time housewife. So, I voiced my concerns. Separating someone from her family and controlling her money and refusing to allow her to earn a living is classic domestic abuse. I reminded her that her son sees his father faithfully every weekend. What do they think about moving out of state and being separated? Oh, he's going to stay with grandma. That way he can continue to see his father and he won't have to change schools. I was so dumbfounded I couldn't speak. I finally just said, wow. This was a woman who when I met her told me she would do anything for her son. A woman who had turned into Mama Bear whenever a doctor or a school official ever criticized him. A woman willing to beat up her son's bullies. She spent hours and dollars she didn't have to help him with his schoolwork and pay for his extracurriculars. This was a woman who refused to prosecute her son's predator or deal with the aftermath. She was now abandoning her son, leaving him 500 miles behind her, foisting him off on her parents and her ex. Just so she could go live with an abuser that she'd known for 1 year. Oh, and she adopted a kitten. With no job and no kid, she had time for a kitten. Wow was the last thing I said to her. I ghosted her big time, the first and only time I've ever done that. I refused to take her calls and I didn't answer her texts. My justification was that she'd had plenty of chances to avoid being selfish and didn't need me to point it out again. My protestations would just result in denials and arguments, without any hope of accomplishing anything positive. She'd already married the guy. And I was going through my own issues, I didn't need hers. So I ghosted her. I want to say I miss her, but I don't. I miss the person I thought she was. But that person doesn't exist anymore. A coworker who still keeps in touch tells me that she's since had twins. In my opinion, anyone who shoves her first kid off on her parents like an unwanted dog in favor of a sugar daddy shouldn't have another child, much less two. But that's just my opinion.